as the 30 had enacted, all the people in Athens excluded from the list of the 3,000 were disempowered, disarmed, and disenfranchised. They continued in their policy to emulate the Spartan model of government, where the 30 would act as an executive council akin to the Gerousia, and the assembly of the 3,000 akin to the homoioi. To this end, they sought to exile all those outside of the list of the 3,000 from Athens to the Attic countryside, thus creating something akin to the perioikoi, the dwellers around, who maintained their freedom but lacked any political power. However, as for the medics, the resident foreigners of Athens, which Theramenes had tried to save, they were robbed of their property and either executed or fled into exile. Many political enemies of the 30 likewise fled Attica in fear of their lives to many of the neighbouring Greek polis. Sparta was quick to outlaw any polis from accepting these refugees with the penalty of a large fine. It would be many of the same city-states that had called for Athens' destruction just 1 year earlier, Corinth, Thebes, and Megara, who would now come to harbour these exiles. The Thebans would go so far as to fine anyone who was complacent in any exile being deported back to Athens. This disregard by many of the Greek polis displayed the growing unpopularity of the Spartans since their victory in the Peloponnesian War. Without a clear opponent, such as the Athenian Delian League, Sparta began to grow increasingly imperialistic. Thus, undermining the 30 went hand in hand with their general disdain for Spartan hegemony. However, the growing number of refugees was becoming an issue for the neighbouring polis, so they actively sought to help bring an end to the 30 in Athens. To that end, at around the beginning of 403 BCE, the Thebans funded Thrasybulus at the head of 70 men to cross the border and capture the fortress of Phyle. Thrasybulus was a hardline democrat who left Athens in exile during the purges by the 30. Thrasybulus had played a major role in the last phases of the Peloponnesian War. In the coup of 411, he was amongst the generals who thwarted the aristocratic faction in Samos. He was also a captain at the Battle of Argonaceae, and, alongside Theramenes, was originally pinned for the failure to collect the dead. Now, with the death of Theramenes, he returned to end the reign of the 30 Tyrants. Thrasybulus posed an existential crisis to the 30's reign, as his position at Phyle was a beacon of resistance to their rule. They feared that the huge number of those exiled would rally around him to topple their government. So, they acted quickly and set out with the 3,000 along with the cavalry to take Phyle and expel Thrasybulus. However, the fortress was situated at a commanding position at the Parnes Mountains, and the terrain was ill-suited for horses. So, when the emboldened cavalry attacked, they were repulsed by the few defenders. Having achieved nothing, the forces of the 30 made camp and changed strategies. They instead thought to wall off the defenders from their supply lines and besiege their position. However, it snowed all throughout the night and the next day, which stopped them from constructing the walls. Continued skirmishes by the men at Phyle drained their supplies, and so the 30 returned to Athens. Knowing the men stationed at Phyle would be free to raid the countryside if they were left unguarded, the 30 sent the majority of the Spartan garrison and some of the cavalry to maintain guard of the passage south of Phyle. By now, close to 700 men gathered at Phyle, comprising mostly medics outfitted as light infantry. With their greater numbers, they sought to expel the enemy from their camp. At night, they marched in secret, setting an ambush right beside the enemy camp. They waited quietly until just before dawn, when the enemy were off guard and, importantly, away from their weapons. The noise of the horse groomers muffled their approach as they moved into position. Charging down the hill, the enemy were caught completely by surprise. With most of the enemy still in their tents, they immediately took flight. Thrasybulus' troops chased the enemy down, causing the entire enemy force to rout. Afterwards, they looted the camp for supplies and arms. By the time the cavalry reinforcements from Athens came to the camp, the attackers had returned to Phyle. More than 120 Spartan hoplites were killed, along with 3 cavalrymen. After this defeat, the 30 no longer considered their rule in Athens secure, so Critias and the 30 sought to claim Eleusis as a refuge should they need it, and they brought with them the cavalry. Upon their arrival, they summoned the Eleusinians to review how many men were of fighting age as to determine the size of the garrison that they would need to hold the city. In truth, Critias and the 30 were weeding out potential dissidents to their occupation. As each of these men were recorded and sent out through the gate, the cavalry, lying in wait, caught and tied each of them up. Then the 30 ordered the head of the cavalrymen to bring them back to Athens for execution. The following day, the 3,000 were summoned to the Odeon at the Acropolis. From the 30, Critias arose to address the crowd. He started out by reminding them how the government was established not just for the 30, but for all of the members of the 3,000. As such, it was necessary for them to share in the dangers just as they shared in the benefits. To solidify their allegiance to the government, he ordered for them all to vote on whether or not to condemn the Eleusinians to death. This was so that both of them would take confidence in and draw fear from the same deeds. All were rendered to cast their vote in the open, whilst the Spartan troops surrounded the Odeon. 300 Eleusinians would be sentenced to death. By the spring of 403 BCE, Thrasybulus' numbers totaled over 1,000 troops. He still retained the advantage over the 30 since his victory, but to capitalize on it, he had to act soon. The longer he waited at Phyle, the greater the chance of Spartan intervention on the side of the 30, a battle he would surely lose. As such, he hatched a daring plan to threaten the lifeline of the Tyrants' base in Athens. During the night, Thrasybulus, leaving a sizable defense at Phyle, marched his men to the Piraeus. Command of the Piraeus would allow him to cut off the supplies to the city and prevent any Spartan reinforcement from docking. As soon as the Tyrants discovered the exiles' seizure of the Piraeus, they rallied the Spartan garrison, the cavalry, and the 3,000 to protect the port. At first, the exiles sought to surround the city, but there were too few in numbers to properly besiege it. Failing this, they fell back to the hill of Mounichia. The troops of the 30 formed at the base of the hill. The decisive battle for Athens was about to take place. The way up the hill of Mounichia was steep and the path narrow, which excluded the cavalry from the battle. The Tyrants' hoplites were thus forced into deep lines to fit on the path, slowing their advance considerably. Meanwhile, at the top of the hill, Thrasybulus sought to encourage his troops and play to the strength of his position. His forces were comprised of a small number of hoplites and a large amount of lightly armed peltasts. So Thrasybulus lined the road with his hoplites, and behind them, he placed his peltasts further up the hill. The steepness of the hill meant that the Tyrants' own peltasts were unable to use many projectiles without hitting their own troops in the back, whilst the exiles on top of the hill could shoot much further into the densely packed hoplites. As the hoplites marched up the hill, they were under a constant barrage of stones and javelins. Critias and the 30 were placed on the left flank, and Thrasybulus made sure to target their position. Under a shower of missiles, the enemy's cohesion weakened. Taking advantage of the confusion, the hoplites of the exiles charged down the hill against the more numerical foes, shattering their formation. In the ensuing rout of the 30, over 70 enemy hoplites fell in battle, and Critias would be found amongst the fallen. The exiles were victorious, chasing the enemy out of the Piraeus. After the battle, the exiles didn't set up a trophy of their fallen enemies, as was the normal practice, nor did they rob the bodies of any citizen except for their arms. When the men of the 30 were collecting their dead under the truce, many men were approaching one another and began to talk as former friends, neighbours, and even some as family. The death of Critias had cut the head off the snake, which were the Tyrants, leaving the rest of the 30 disorganized and isolated from the oligarchic political base. In his Politics, Aristotle describes the fundamental mistake of oligarchies. For nowhere are 100 men born noble and good, but there are always this many rich men. He goes on to describe how oligarchies suffer two key conflicts, one amongst the oligarchs and another between the oligarchs and the people. The strife between Critias and Theramenes was an example of the former. Theramenes sought to moderate the 30, to achieve an ideal and noble oligarchy. However, as Aristotle pointed out, this was wholly unrealistic. Critias, meanwhile, sought an extreme oligarchy, akin to the Spartan model of government, whose power was ultimately corrupt. By Critias killing Theramenes, the 30 fell prey to this conflict. Their unrestrained tyranny thereafter led to the second conflict, the oligarchs against the people. As they disempowered, disenfranchised, and displaced those not on the list of the 3,000, they made themselves enemies of the people. Democrats, rivals, and the medics were executed, and so too were they turned against the 30. The support of the people was therefore thrown onto the first bastion of resistance, Thrasybulus. Even amongst the fellow oligarchs, the 30 had to bring them in line through guilt and fear. For these reasons, the oligarchy of the 30 failed due to both internal strife amongst its members and the external danger of the popular uprising. The death of Critias and the defeat of their forces weakened their grasp on power, which would ultimately be the death knell of their tyranny. The following day, the 3,000 gathered before the council house, and there emerged a rift on what to do. Those who were accomplices of the 30's tyranny feared the consequences of their actions and fiercely maintained that they shouldn't give in to the exiles. Then there were those who believed they did nothing wrong and thought they had the right to govern the city. Although both groups could agree that it was not right to obey the 30 nor to permit them to continue destroying their city. So they voted to remove the 30 from office, who now made use of Eleusis as their refuge, and elected a council of 10 to put an end to the civil war. However, as soon as these men were put in charge, they were quick to assert their own authority and declared themselves opposed to both the 30 and the exiles. Rule over Athens then was split into three opposing parties: the Council of 10 in Athens, who usurped power, the exiles, led by the Democrat Thrasybulus at the Piraeus, and the deposed remains of the 30 tyrants, who now resided in Eleusis. The chaos of the Athenian civil war made one thing above all clear: the Spartans would have to intervene.